Welcome back to Inside Europe, the weekly current affairs podcast and radio program from DW, Germany's international broadcaster. I'm Laura Kabelka in Berlin. In France last month, an 18-year-old man was arrested on his way to school after police who had been following his internet activity on the manosphere saw a message he posted threatening murder. He was found to be carrying 2 long knives. And he's been charged with terrorism. The first time in the country that terrorism charges have been brought against someone identified as part of the incel movement, where incel stands for involuntary celibate. From Paris, John Lawrenson reports.
C'est une première en France, un attentat d'un masculiniste revendiqué.
French TV viewers discovered a few weeks ago that for the first time in this country, a young man believed by police to be under the influence of what the French call masculinist ideology had been arrested for terrorism. Apparently, the young man had been on the brink of carrying out a deadly knife attack. Identified only as Timothy G., police had been following his online activity for several weeks because he'd become active in incel chat groups. On the morning of his arrest, he posted, "If they don't let me into 11th grade, I'm going to commit carnage." Police swooped, found 2 knives in his school bag. They immediately classified the incident as an act of terrorism, as Interior Minister Gérald Darmanin explained. This is terrorism in the proper sense of the word, he said. The incel movement is, he said, astonishing for the French, but these people are capable of killing women because they believe they are responsible for society's evils. Evian Leidig is an independent researcher specialised in online extremism and radicalisation.
The arrest of this young man is representative of what is a growing threat of violent misogynistic terrorism, some of which could be classified as incel, although not all violent misogynists do identify with that incel label.
Was his young age typical?
When it comes at least to violent misogynists or to incel perpetrators, they tend to err on the younger side. These are usually boys between the ages of even as young as 13, but more commonly late teenage years to early adulthood. Whereas when it comes, for example, to, say, extreme right or Islamist attacks, we tend to see perpetrators on the older age spectrum.
You mentioned Islamist attacks, for example. Europol, as you will have seen, published a few days ago stats on terrorist attacks in 2024, the biggest number. The only deadly attacks, in fact, were jihadi attacks. Then a close second came left-wing and anarchist. There was one non-fatal attack described as right-wing. Does this mean that incel violence is, for the moment at least, a comparatively small-scale phenomenon?
Well, based on Europol's report, it could indicate that perhaps violent misogyny or incel attacks are marginal in comparison to some other ideological motivators. But it is, unfortunately, a type of violence that we're seeing grow as there's been more reported cases of individuals inspired by violent misogyny or incel ideology. But the other difficulty with this type of attack is that oftentimes governments don't have the legal frameworks in place to be able to classify individuals under this, incel as an act of terrorism. We've only started to see a couple of governments, for example, in Canada, that for the first time prosecuted individuals with incel-motivated ideology.
Would you say that the incel mindset is linked to other mindsets or ideologies that might be described as terrorist?
We do see a close alignment between incels and right-wing extremism, but that's mainly because we see misogyny being the glue between these two different types of motivations. However, when it comes to incels or to violent misogynists, one way that we can separate them from the extreme right is a very sole focus on targeting women and LGBTQ individuals, and not necessarily having such a clear political ideology that right-wing extremists might have in terms of anti-immigration, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, etc. So there are some very clear differences with incel terrorism compared to other types of ideological violence.
Meanwhile, the 18-year-old suspected of being France's first incel terrorist is being held in custody, with the judiciary rejecting a call from his lawyer to allow him to await trial outside of prison. John Lawrenson, DW, Paris.
Incels are a subgroup of a larger phenomenon, the manosphere. It's a whole spectrum of online communities where men discuss masculinity, relationships, looks, and gender politics. Let's take a deep dive.
What is going on with young men right now?
The manosphere.
Proliferation of misogyny online.
The manosphere.
The manosphere.
Men are at the most risk of social isolation.
A majority of British young men regularly engage with masculinity influencers online.
Most people would rail against being called a misogynist, but not Andrew Tate.
So, what kind of voices do you find on the manosphere? At the extreme end, you have the former kickboxer and alleged sex trafficker Andrew Tate.
But females are barely sentient. Even the good ones.
The manosphere also includes countless other voices, like Bismarck Ebiwe, Cliff Watley, Austin Dunham, or David Cooley.
How to properly look smacks.
Everybody's a high-value woman until it's time to submit.
Here are 3 signs that you have some small d beta male energy.
The media is controlled by women.
There are also much more complex voices that, whilst not strictly part of the manosphere itself, could be described as manosphere adjacent, like the Canadian public intellectual Jordan Peterson.
It's a very rare woman who at the age of 30 doesn't consider having a child her primary desire. And the ones that don't consider that, generally, in my observation, there's something that isn't quite right.
Joe Rogan, Spotify's most streamed podcaster, holds a broad range of political opinions and is critical of extremes. However, because of his repeated platforming of anti-feminist figures, researchers often see him as a mainstream gateway to the manosphere, particularly when he voices incel-influenced theories like this.
Women are only attracted to 20% of the men.
The manosphere ranges from outright misogynistic content to tips on how to get ripped and rich. But anti-feminism does unify this sphere.
One of the common narratives is that men are the victims, the true victims in feminist-dominated societies. What we see here is actually the reframing of gender justice as a threat to male identity. It's a powerful echo chamber.
You just heard from Ellie Scambor, the research director of the Institute for Masculinity Research and Gender Studies in Graz, Austria. You'll hear more from her later. The manosphere is part of a larger trend around the world, namely the call for a return to supposedly traditional values. And many analysts are crediting the manosphere with playing a big role in an emerging gender split that's playing out in elections all over the world. Young men voting to the right, young women becoming more liberal. But why is this backlash against progressive policies particularly seen in young men? And how does the popularity of the manosphere affect us all?
Because it really does seem to boys that the world hates men at times. So it's very easy to distort that and go, yeah, the world does hate men. I don't hate you, come this way. And that's what happened with me.
This is Will Adolphy. He's now in his early 30s and lives on the coast in the UK. He first got in touch with the manosphere about 13 years ago. And he really got into it.
Every free moment I had, really, yeah.
I got to speak to Will about what attracted him and so many other men and boys to this kind of content. You will also hear from researchers who explain the impact of the manosphere on men's health, why this concerns everyone and what can be done about it. I would like to place a trigger warning here. This will not be an easy journey. Even if you've not watched his content, you've probably heard of the notorious influencer Andrew Tate. Or perhaps you've seen the gut-wrenching British miniseries Adolescence. And angry men identifying with incel culture sometimes do turn online misogyny into real-life murder, as happened in California in 2014, or Canada in 2018, or Florida in the same year, or New Mexico the year before. But the manosphere is nuanced. It's not one coherent group. And it's constantly evolving. So before we follow Will down the manosphere rabbit hole and back, here's a quick glossary of terms and symbols as a starting point. Research director Ellie Scambor will walk us through.
incels, short for involuntary celibates.
What they believe is that they are structurally denied access to intimate relationship and sex, and they blame women for it. They also have a quite clear concept about the hierarchical order of men. So men who are considered attractive, for example, and successful, they are labeled as chads. They call them chads. And incels perceive themselves as genetically disadvantaged, as lonely, as unloved, as devalued.
The 80-20 rule, or the Pareto principle.
The incel interpretation of the 80-20 rule is 80% of women want the top of the 20% of men. What they say is women are choosing only the very attractive man, the high status man, the chads, and rejecting all the other men, the average man, and the low value man, and they see themselves as the low value man.
Pickup artists.
For them, the role of women is different. Success with women is a matter of training and strategies. So they provide videos and they show behavioral tactics, very often framed through pseudo-scientific arguments, tactics to control women, to manipulate intimate relationship. Women here are not enemies, but they are targets to be won over, and actually they are completely devalued also.
Men going their own way.
This group doesn't really see connection to women, but complete withdrawal. So they see relationship with women as inherently dangerous, as actually damaging men. So their concept of masculinity is centered on autonomy and detachment.
Looks maxing.
The strategy of maximizing improvement of the physical appearance. There's a wide range of strategies, quite extreme measures. So they talk about physical fitness, muscle building and so on, but also dental procedures, for example, jaw corrections that should be made.
Alpha versus beta.
Chads would be alpha men from their perspective. So they differentiate between the men who are chosen from women, so the 80-20 rule, and the alpha men would be part of this group.
Austrian research director Ellis Gambor there. But now back to Will, who spent a few years consuming such content. I asked him to describe his life before entering the manosphere.
I remember being 14 years old and just finding everything too much. Home life, school life. I was crying on my mum's bed and she put her hand on me and she said to me, "You care too much." And that was her way of supporting me. And so from that point on, I kind of became the whatever I don't care man. At school, I started to act out. I started to fight back.
Will told me that he was struggling with mental health issues. Heading into his 20s, it got worse. He started having panic attacks and bouts of depression.
And I just felt submerged by emotional intensity. I was lost. I wasn't earning that much. And also 2016, so the world had begun to kind of express resentment towards masculinity, towards the man box, towards men. The Me Too movement was happening, and there was this rhetoric and message that I was receiving directly from people to my face, and often online, which was, "You've had your time. Men, you're privileged."
Research director Ellis Gambor says that just like Will, many men experience current developments such as gender equality policies as a loss of orientation.
We see that public discourses increasingly center the voices of marginalized groups, thinking about people of color, queer communities. This is urgently needed, but some may see it as a loss of their own relevance. So the return to traditional models can be seen as an attempt to reclaim visibility, to get it back.
Will interpreted this rhetoric as claiming that men have it easy and it's time for women to come to the front. But he felt that he'd never had it easy, that he'd never been at the front. It didn't feel fair.
I really just wanted to let these people know how difficult life was for me at that time. I didn't want to be here. So you can understand how confusing it is as someone who's struggling so much with their mental health to then be told that they're privileged. It's a really hard thing to process. And there's something about the way in which we're still socializing boys and men, which has a direct impact on our capacity to process emotions.
This last point again relates to the man box, a term Will mentioned earlier.
The man box.
A kind of invisible set of rules, let's call it cultural expectations that define how, under question marks now, a real man should think, a real man should feel or should behave. And these rules are surprisingly consistent across different countries and cultures.
Inside this box, Ellie tells me, are rigid ideas like a man must never show fear or vulnerability. He must act tough, not cook, make money and solve problems alone. In a recent study with 3,000 men in the UK, Mexico and the US, researchers found that on average a third of the respondents identified with such gender norms.
Especially for young men who feel insecure or who feel isolated, these very traditional ideas still offer a sense of belonging and structure. So the problem is, if you stay in the man box, if you share these thoughts, if you internalize it, you constantly have to prove your manhood. And often the pressure becomes also self-destructive. And this is where we see a direct connection to the manosphere, where these traditional expectations, even hyper-masculinity ideas are not just preserved, but actively celebrated and radicalized.
Will's dream back then was to become a famous actor. He wanted money and to be attractive for women.
When I met the reality after university, which I trained as an actor, the reality was, oh my goodness, everything's so expensive. I was living in London. I was paying £750 per month to live in this shed that literally had no window. The one thing I had was, okay, I'm going to start a business. So I started a theatre company. I put everything into this theatre company and I was working at a school. And yeah, it was around this sort of time I started to watch podcasts or listen to podcasts and watch YouTube clips.
Will was looking for guidance and self-improvement. And like so many others, he found advice online.
This content is mainstream, it's not a subculture. But actually for most young men, they're not entering this space because they're looking for violent, misogynistic, harmful content. They're entering it because they're looking for advice, normally advice about like dating, advice about making money, advice about getting fit. And they're entering it through kind of the most mainstream conduit, which is likely to be kind of one of the big name influencers.
You just heard from Sarah Sternberg. She's the global director for Reimagining Masculinities at the Movember Foundation. Movember started as this small movement for men to sport a moustache in November to spark conversations about men's health. Now they're the biggest charity working on this topic globally. Sarah told me that for a lot of men, manosphere influencers can be motivating, inspiring. That was also the case for Will at first.
I was watching guys in suits, academics, who at first sounded incredibly reasonable. I felt validated, I felt seen, and it was so captivating. The voice, it drew me in. It was articulate, bold, clear, confident, and these people were saying things that I didn't think I could say that I wanted to say. And then what happens when a person gets pulled in and one develops an emotional attachment to the influencer, like I did, this person became a father figure to me.
You're listening to Inside Europe. I'm Laura Kabelka in Germany.
To the grandkids, not just cause you're finding where the dime is. My lines that were firing like a 9 is. Hear them sirens, why? Cause a short line is. I'm not finding with the height is. Cause you're finding a mic and they never like this. 6'4", you can try, can oversight this. One smoke, put this in your pipe and the light it. Big man, you can size it. Big man, you can sight it. Big man, you can fight it. But the Lord knows it ain't wise if you try it. Big man, you can size it. Big man, you can sight it. Big man, you can fight it. But the Lord knows it ain't wise if you try it.
So Will would spend every free moment watching or listening to this content. It helped him get out of the ditch he was in. But then the content started to change.
It just became more and more resentful towards women. Before I knew it, I was living in a binary world where it felt like you were either on side or you were against me. Fundamentally, it was really hard to experience inner peace because I had these polarity of voices in my head, like the masculinity influencer arguing with a feminist in my head. And It impacted my relationship with my partner at the time. You know, whenever she would talk about her experiences as a woman, I just felt like it was threatening my experience as a man.
So in the short term, Will received some benefits, but in the long term, he told me, this content further contributed to his depression, anxiety, anger, feeling of worthlessness, and ultimately suicide risk. The Movember charity did a large-scale study on the effects of masculinity influencers, which suggests that this is not a coincidence. They found that those regularly engaged with this content are more likely to report feelings associated with poor mental health.
They're also much more likely to take risky health behaviours, so they're much more likely to take steroids, diet pills, exercise when injured, than those who don't regularly engage.
Will said that ultimately the deeper issues in his life were going unaddressed, and he still felt isolated and lonely, also reinforced by this us versus them worldview. In the offline world, he told me, he didn't have many discussions about politics or feminism because it would just turn into an argument and then he'd shut down.
The harder thing to realize is just the conversations I wasn't having rather than the conversations I was having.
So fast forward a few years to today.
This meeting is being recorded.
There we go. Hi, can everyone hear me okay? We've got a couple.
Will has changed his life completely. He's now a psychotherapist and he goes to schools across the country to talk to boys about what happened to him and to create spaces for them to open up as well. You can follow him on Instagram @PsychWill, where he runs monthly Q&As to support parents in navigating what he calls the online masculinity crisis. I asked him how all this change came about.
Empathy was the answer. I empathized with myself and then I began to feel empathy for other people. And then this kind of threat detection system of like, is this person against me? Are they with me? It just kind of relaxed. And I started to see, I was like, oh my God, we all want the same thing. We want to be seen. We all want to be heard. The fear started to go away because I had these relationships with people that I had once demonized in my head. Started to meet, you know, women that told me they were feminists. I'd started to meet, I met a non-binary person. And just slowly but surely, I started to realize that the online world is very different from the real world. The real world is far more complicated and far more nuanced than this binary worldview I developed. So my worldview just started to crumble, really.
This process was a slow one. First, Will focused on himself. Then, he reflected on his main influencer and took him off the pedestal. He started to rebuild through conversations where he didn't feel judged. Will emphasized this because he says when boys and men feel judged, it can bring up shame, anger, and defensiveness.
I have learned that shuts down the conversation. It disengages boys. And when boys are disengaged, guess who engages them? Guess what engages them? It's the online world.
That's exactly why research director Elise Gambor recommends the following approach to parents and teachers.
We need to create a space for open discussion, for open conversation, a curious conversation. We should rather ask questions and listen than giving advice. Instead of saying that's nonsense, we should rather ask kids what's interesting about the video, why is it important for you?
Ellie also says that there is still a lack of awareness, that many still don't understand that especially young people are living online. These digital spaces are not a separate part of one's life. She suggests looking for the following signs that someone is drifting into the manosphere.
This can include misogynist statements or anti-queer remarks. It could include withdrawal, for example, from friends or also from the families. Or it could include that suddenly the term red pill or black pill is used, or the 80-20 rule, or they talk about femoid.
Femoid, females.
A dehumanizing term for women, meaning they are not real human.
Red pill, black pill.
I think you know the movie Matrix. If you take a red pill, this stands for awakening. You can realize that you are being oppressed in a feminist system. If you take the blue pill, you can realize it. The black pill ideology represents more a radical hopelessness. They have a very nihilistic concept about themselves and they cannot change it, and they blame women for this, and this is why some of them really, they take the gun and go out and kill women.
In the UK, a YouGov study in 2023 found that only 1 in 6 boys aged 6 to 15 have a positive view of Andrew Tate. But most of them do know him. And according to Will, the fact that they are watching this content means it will creep into their heads.
Just because someone is saying they don't like or do like, what I have learned is it's very hard to know how what I'm watching is impacting me. Because if I'm watching it over and over and over, it almost becomes like a form of brainwashing.
The manosphere is not only filling, but also profiting from a void. Let's not forget, these influencers are making money off this content. Controversial streamer Sneeko, for example, said he was making tens of thousands of dollars monthly on YouTube alone. That was, of course, before he was banned for violating community guidelines. Men and boys want to be addressed. They are looking for answers to their struggles. There are other role models out there, however.
The reality is that boys won't just be boys. Boys will be what we teach them to be.
Ben Hurst, for example, is promoting healthy masculinity online, and he also gives workshops at schools. GQ magazine calls him one of the anti-Tates. But his account seems like a drop in the ocean compared to the millions of views that Andrew Tate videos, uploaded by third parties since Tate's accounts were blocked, still attract. Apart from healthier role models, Sarah Sternberg from Movember says that it's important to focus on community building and destigmatizing emotional vulnerability.
And so a big part of our work at Movember is thinking about kind of what can be done to strengthen young men's friendships and relationships with one another, particularly as they kind of emerge into adulthood. I think there's some really sad statistic that by the age of 40, I think 1 in 5 men have like no close friends. So male friendship is something that really does sort of disappear for young men as they get older. And that's not the case for women. And we know that like social connections have such a powerful role to play in like protecting your health.
Sarah told me that they're also training therapists to better adapt to men's needs. And men's health, she argues, isn't only an issue affecting men.
Men's health, I think, is an area of focus for us, partly because it is underfunded and underexplored, but also because it has a big social impact on those around men. There are links, certainly, around mental health, poor mental health, and men and kind of violence.
As we've heard earlier, those consuming manosphere content reported feelings associated with poorer health, and that ripples out to affect others. Just look at the correlation between poor mental health and domestic violence, for example. So if we do succeed in supporting young men properly, if we acknowledge their struggles, move beyond the man box and provide healthier role models, this would benefit everyone. Ellie Scambor has the statistics to prove it. Her Institute for Masculinity Research and Gender Studies has conducted a new cross-Austria study, and it shows that a fair distribution of unpaid care work within the family can prevent domestic violence. When the father, however, has the final say in family decisions, for example, the risk of physical violence against children is greatest. Focusing on men's health and struggles doesn't have to take away from the importance of women's or minorities' issues.
It's really important for me to say that and be explicit about it. It's an and, not an or.
Will Adolphy agrees.
And we get trapped in that limbo, this zero-sum game of, if we talk about your pain, then that devalidates mine. And what I have learned is that there's space for it all.
And that's it for today. This program was produced by Kate Laycock and me, Laura Kabelka. Our sound engineers were Michael Springer and Ben Zemke. Inside Europe comes to you from DW in Bonn and Berlin.